So in this video, we're going to be talking about grid and also grid items and really anything you can jam inside of a grid. It's like Flex, but you could do more varied things with it. And I think it's a little bit more technical, I guess I would say. So we're going to look at the docs. So we're going to look at some of the cool basic things you could do. And then in the examples, I'm going to jump between taking the code examples from the docs and explaining how and why they work. And then I'm going to show you maybe an example or two, at least one example of my own use of the grid. So let's get to seeing what this stuff could do. So looking at the docs for grid, we could see that it says a primitive useful for grid layouts. That sentence reads a little odd. Maybe it's just the time of day. But a grid is a box. Everything's a box with a display grid, and it comes with helpful style shorthand, and it renders a div element. So let's look at the import, and right below it, template columns. We can see we obviously have a grid, but then we have grid items. You don't necessarily have to jam grid items in there. Once again, everything is a box, so you customize as you want to. But let's look at the actual usage here. So we have these 5 grids, these blue areas, these blue dot 500 areas here. And we have the template columns, this repeats, 1 fraction, gap 6, all this other stuff. I will talk about these and the next section, the spanning columns, in the examples. I'm going to retype this stuff out and I'm going to explain it a little bit more. But as you can see here, we just kind of have this linear view here. But as we go down to the spanning columns, we can see that we have this like 2D-ish now kind of approach. Not only do we have rows, but we also have columns as well. And this is the second example. I think there's going to be a third, maybe a fourth as well, that I'll show as well. But I'm going to break this down in our example section of how this is exactly working, because some libraries you come from, it sets a lot of this stuff up for you. And I think kind of takes that tooling out of your hand. This is a little bit more specific and a bit more, I guess, closer to CSS than just kind of giving you something easy to work with that you don't really have to think about. So I'm going to go over this in the next section here, but just know that if you could do this, imagine the cool kind of artwork, designs, putting pictures in, text that you could go inside, because you could have inside of a grid item, have another grid doing all sorts of other interesting stuff. We have starting and ending lines here. I'm going to cover this as well because I needed to catch up on my grid as well when I was studying this. And I'm going to show you how these 2 things right here are the exact same. You could just go about creating them 2 different ways. And so we can do that with call start, call end, and then we also have call span as well. It really just depends upon your preference. And also for your reference as well, there's a ton of props down here at the bottom that we could use. I'm going to try and use as many as I can that I could go over. This is one of those things where you have a set of props, but as long as you have a creative mind, you could do a lot of things with grid. The same you can with like Flex or really any of these kinds of layouts. So I'm going to try and do my my best job here, but hey, let's get to coding and show you how this actually works in practice. All right, in this first explanation, what we're going to do is actually take something from the docs and I'm going to lay it out and I'm going to explain it, because for me, it's been a hot minute since I've specifically worked with grids or something where I had to like really think about it and it didn't automate the layout process for me. So I'm just going to do that for y'all. So let's go ahead and type this out and I'll explain it. So now that we have this typed out, it's very similar. I think I've made some padding and some height adjustments, but this is essentially the same example we see from the docs. And so we're looking at this here and we see these boxes. I know we were talking about grid items, so where are they? Like I said, you don't necessarily have to use grid items, but I just wanted to explain this. I think is the first example they gave. And so we have this gap 3 right here. So this is essentially the gaps in between each of these items here. So if we were to expand this to, say, 9, you would see that each box in there has less width to work with. So if we bring it down to 2, even greater space they would gain. But we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As we could see, we could count of these blue boxes right here. And so how are these so evenly spaced out? And we can see up here, this is being controlled by template columns. So it says repeat, and we have 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1 FR. FR stands for fraction. And so it will just take up whatever space is available, and it like very evenly divides that on out here. So what would happen if we made a 6th one? Let's check this out. We would see it goes to the next, well, row right here, because there's only 5 available. Let's make this 6. And we can see that it jams it up here. So this repeat right here is how many of these items or specific elements are being allowed in its column right here, because this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if we wanted to do 3, we still have all 6 right here, but you can see that it's treating them differently. And so this is how this template columns works with the nested items inside of it. Now let's go to the next section of this video, and I'm going to talk about another document explanation. Okay, so there's another section in the documentation where they're showing not only rows, but columns, and you could kind of do some neat stuff with it. So let's get to typing it out and I'll explain it. Looking at this example here, this should look very familiar from the documentation. So grid, like I said previously, you could control the rows and the columns. And so there's a lot more to think about as you're organizing your layout and putting stuff out there. Like I also said, you could do a lot of really creative and cool stuff with grids. And we could see the start of something very interesting and fascinating right here. And so I think the most important thing to look at when you see this is not just the possibilities, but how do we take what's happening in the grid with the rows and columns and translate them down below so we know how to pull off certain styles of layouts? Because you can see visually what's going on, but how do you technically do it? So let's not forget here, we have columns. So there's 5 of them. So it's going to be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're going to be evenly spaced. And now that we fixed that typo, I think it just kind of knew what to do. So we have that for the rows. So the rows, we have 2 rows right here. And a row is this way, and then a row is right here. So we can see that these rows as well are evenly spaced on out. Okay, the gaps we could explain. So we have the gap not only between these columns right here, but between the row as well. But there's not a gap right here. Well, how does this work? Well, we know we have 2 rows, right? And sorry if you heard that in the background. That's my annoyingly loud apartment washer. So we have 2 rows right here. We're allowed 2 rows right here. So this first item where this 1 is, this is going to take up row 1 and row 2. For the column span, this only takes up 1 column, which is why it's this rectangular shape. And so if we go back up to here for the first row, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because there's only 5 columns are allowed in this layout. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what happens to this fourth one? Well, like in the last example, if you add something outside of the repeat, say you have, 5 repeat in the column here, but you have 6 items, it's going to be jammed into the next row automatically. And so since we have this row span right here, coming down here, this automatically takes up one of the column spaces when we hit the second row. And since it's doing that, we now have 4 spaces left for number 4 here. And 4 plus 1 is 5. And that's how many columns we're allowed to use for each of the 2 rows that we have. And so I know that could be a little odd. That took me a little bit to look at because, like I said, I don't use columns in this specific of a way, or at least haven't in a while. But this is how you can start doing really cool examples. And so you can think how easy it may be now to make sidebars, or even inside of little cool rectangular or even square layouts like this, you could put more grids and more grid items on the inside and start dividing this up. And so this is the second example from the docs explained. And let's move on to, I think, the next example. I think I have 4 of them for you today. So in this example here, it's going to be the last document explanation, because the next example, the fourth one, is going to be some custom code I wrote. What we're going to do is look at call span, call end, call start, and we're going to see how you could arrive at the same kind of code layout 2 different ways. So let's get to doing that. What we see right here is a grid item here and a grid item here. We have tomato and this one called papaya whip. I've never heard the word papaya whip before actually digging into this library. So we see here we have call span 2. Now let's start at the beginning here, and the template columns we have. So remember, column, they're coming from the top, not from the side. We have 5 we're allowed. And we have a gap of 6 that explains this right here. And I have a little bit of padding at the top. So this call span makes sense. This is taking up the first 2. Well, let's look at the second one. We have column start. All right. So we're skipping 1. So we have 1, 2. We're skipping 3. And we have 4. But this is weird right here. We have column end, which is 6. Well, how do I know if it's 6? Like, okay, what if I made a mistake and I go in here and type 5? We see right here that it gets shorter and doesn't fill up the entire, section that we think it's going to. And why is that? This is because, at least how I've come to this from looking at the documentation, at least on from Mozilla, wasn't that helpful for me. So I looked at a picture, someone etched it out on a random site. If you put in 6 right here, what happens is the column ends right before you would have a 6th column. So this is technically, you could think of this the end of 5. So if you use column end, it's going to be 1 higher than the amount of columns you have, or for that case, rows, because this stops right before the next one. So if I was to have this here at 5, we're starting at 4, and we're ending right before we hit the 5th one, so we're only using 1 column right here. So how do I make these 2 the same? If I start with column start here, can I still use call span 2 right here and get the same result? 100%. The call end just gives you a little bit more control, at least from a different aspect. So now we see that as we expand these on out, still the same lengths, but you could either use call end or the call span, depending on whatever you're comfortable with or whatever works for you. So enough of the document explanations. Let's go. And in the next section, we're going to look at I think it's like a color swatch, I think is the name of it. We're going to create using hooks. In this final example, what we're going to do is create a grid. We're going to have a grid item, then we're going to put a grid with grid items inside of that. And we're going to have a hook that's going to cycle through a series of colors. So I don't know if they're called swatches or whatever, but if you ever go to a paint store, they'll have like all the colors for like purple or red lined up from their lightest to darkest color. So we're going to do something like that here. Before we continue, what I'm just going to do is explain what we have so far. So we have this array of colors right here. We have an index, and this is the thing we're going to use to move through each of these colors. And then we have change color. We have not hooked this function up to anything yet, but it's this ternary operator, which is, shown by the question mark and the colon here. So if it's the case that our index is greater than or equal to the length of the colors minus 1. So this is a way of saying, hey, are we at the end of the array? We're going to reset it back to 0. And if it's not the case, we're just going to continue to add to the index to move through our colors array up here. So let's do this grid item cool stuff. Okay, so now that we have that done here, we're going to look through this step by step. And so we've already covered what's up here. So I hate semicolons. Let's move down below here. And I'm going to expand some of this out just so that it's a little bit easier to go through. So we have this master grid going on right here as we see everything is just one line. And there's only 6 columns and they're going to all be evenly spaced out. So our first grid item is this right here because it's call span 5. So obviously this grid item as a button right here is hanging out and there's that gap. So inside of that we put a grid, and what we're doing is we're taking this call span of 5 and we're chopping it into 6 even parts. So this is one fraction here. So each one's going to get the same amount. And we have the colors, which is referencing to the array up here, the index, which is referencing this right here. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which shows you it gets darker as it goes along. Our last grid item here, we've switched into being a button. It just looked a heck of a lot nicer than putting a button inside of a grid item. We have a call span of 1. So now we have 5 plus 1 is the 6 columns. It's the same height as the other grid item next to it. Give it a turquoise background. I think it looks like crap, but whatever. I'm not good with my colors. So let's click this. And what we're going to see is this is going to start off at gray, go to teal, purple, pink, red, and then orange. And it starts over. And so this is how you could have a grid inside of a grid item inside of a grid. This is a very, I'd say, low level kind of example, but as you're able to use rows and columns, you could do some pretty trippy stuff with it. So feel to go out there, experiment, tag me in stuff that you've done, have some fun. And if you like this, like, share, subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.